The Old West, with its vast plains and relentless deserts, was a land where survival was never guaranteed. Imagine the vastness of an unexplored land where the sky seemed to be the only limit and the cracked, dry soil threatened to swallow the dreams of thousands of pioneers. The West wasn't just a challenge of adaptation. It was a true struggle against time, nature, and often against life itself. The first settlers faced extreme conditions: scorching heat during the day, freezing nights, sandstorms, and the immense solitude that permeated the region. Every step taken in this new world was a risk, but the hope for a better future, the promise of a new life, made them continue the journey. Amidst this adversity, a small group of silent heroes played a crucial role in crossing the West: the Mules. Often forgotten in historical narratives, they were the true forces behind turning the dream of Western expansion into a reality. Without them, the pioneer caravans would have never managed to cross vast deserts, climb treacherous mountains, or reach the most remote and unexplored places. The mules, with their impressive endurance, became the backbone of the entire expedition. They were more than just pack animals. They were the foundation of the hope for those seeking something new and better. Far from the difficulties of their previous lives, the history of the West is, in fact, a history of endurance. While cowboys and settlers fought against the elements, the mules kept moving tirelessly, always bearing the weight of dreams and necessities. They carried everything, from food and medical supplies to the tools needed to build new towns. Although the men became heroes, it was often the mules who played the hardest role. They were there, day after day, carrying everything needed to ensure survival and progress. Even when the landscape around them turned into a sea of dust and desolation. However, the importance of the mules in the West goes beyond simple cargo transport. They became symbols of perseverance. Their role in the history of the Old West was not just as helpers, but as protagonists in a silent struggle for life. If the pioneers were there to conquer the land, it was the mules that helped them conquer survival. They crossed the desert, with unwavering determination, broke through mountains that seemed impenetrable, and moved forward even when the winds of the West seemed to want to erase them from history. Behind every great expedition and every movement of colonization, they were there, humble but essential. At the heart of the relentless West, mules were more than pack animals. They were living technology. The cross between horse and donkey yielded bodies built for heat, sure-footed on treacherous trails, thrifty with water, and patient enough to outlast shale slopes where wheels snapped. While horses faltered on scree and oxen bogged down in mud, mules kept going, turning footpaths into roots and roots into lifelines. If there was food on the table, medicine in the saddlebag, and hope on the horizon, there was almost always a mule pulling that future forward. The West's economy beat to the rhythm of hooves. From mining camps to sawmills, from mail stations to the leading edge of the railroads, mules hauled dynamite, beams, tools, water, and letters, the things that kept the machine turning. Entire towns measured their health by the size of the mule train arriving at dusk. Without them, gold stayed locked in rock, harvests rotted in the fields, and the telegraph wire was nothing but a humming line in the wind. Between man and mule, a partnership of codes and silences took shape. The muleteer tied loads so the weight could breathe, sense the shorter stride on climbs, knew the whistle that soothed on a narrow bridge, the rain cue that said, "Now." The mule, in turn, read the trail like a map etched into the ground, walked when the edge was false, moved only where a way truly existed. It wasn't empty stubbornness. It was intelligent economy of effort, the difference between plunging into a ravine and reaching camp before sunset. But that alliance came at a cost that still stirs anger. Mules were overburdened until hide broke, driven through freezing rivers, hurried up hills to satisfy bosses who took the credit and shared the crumbs. When silver glittered in headlines, the names remembered were colonels, engineers, and bankers. Never the animals that carried the world on their backs. The West sang ballads about gunmen, yet forgot the scars on the backs that hauled lumber, bread, and medicine day after day. Here's the hook. If mules sustained progress, what happened when the road vanished in a sandstorm, a canteen went missing, and a single horseshoe nail worked loose? In the next chapter, we follow a caravan into a sea of dust and learn step by step the true price of crossing the void. As the West expanded, mules became more than mere tools. They were the guardians of hope. Each journey through the vastness of unknown lands meant for the pioneers a constant battle against the wild nature, against invisible dangers, and sometimes against their own human limits. Mule caravans weren't just expeditions. They were direct confrontations with an invisible enemy, the emptiness of the desert, the immensity of the unknown. Every step taken by the animals was a calculated risk, a survival strategy that only the mules seemed to understand. On long journeys, mules bore heavy loads, crossing icy rivers, climbing treacherous mountains, facing sandstorms, and enduring scorching heat that could melt the very leather of their riders. Each day brought new challenges, and the mules, always with their strength renewed by the relentless routine, kept moving without question. The weight of the saddlebags carried wasn't just physical, but symbolic. In them rested the dreams, the ambitions, the lives of the people who, in search of a new chance, relied on the silence and unyielding endurance of these animals. But this sacrifice didn't come without consequences. The mules, despite their incredible endurance, were often pushed to give everything they had until their bodies could go no further. Some couldn't withstand the pressure of the journey. The extreme heat, lack of water, and treacherous terrain took their toll. Mules would collapse from exhaustion, but the caravan could not stop. It was a cruel cycle where the loss of one animal meant the loss of a piece of hope. However, the pioneers had no choice but to press on, fully aware that their survival depended on their ability to keep moving, always with the certainty that the mule caravan was carrying with it the chance for a fresh start. Yet, the sacrifices of the mules went unrecognized. While the cowboys and settlers were celebrated as heroes, the mules were only seen as tools of labor. They were never credited with the progress, never remembered for the achievements they made possible. They were invisible, despite being the true foundation of cities, the exploration of lands, and the realization of pioneers' dreams. Their pain, exhaustion, and perseverance were never sung in ballads, but without them, the West would not have been conquered. Progress in the Old West would not have been possible without the immense, silent labor of the mules. While the settlers planted the seeds of their new lives, the mules carried the solid foundation that would make these seeds viable. The first cities, small pioneer towns, and mining camps were built not only by human strength, but by the immeasurable effort of these animals. They carried heavy timber for the construction of houses and shops, brought essential supplies such as food, tools, and materials for creating infrastructure, and were used to pull the first wagons for railroads, which were crucial for communication and trade. As the cities began to grow, mules remained key players in this urbanization process. They were essential for transporting goods from one town to another, establishing connections between small settlements, and ensuring that the populations didn't suffer from shortages. Even with the advent of railroads, which eventually replaced mules for transporting large amounts of cargo, they still played a critical role in expanding cities. In many places, it was the mules that carried the heaviest loads between the tracks and small shops or depots, ensuring the constant supply of essential products. However, recognition for these contributions was minimal. Mules were seen as mere tools, part of the rural landscape of the West, while the men who used their strength to build the cities were praised. No town square was erected in tribute to the mules. No monument was made in their memory. History preferred to glorify the pioneers, explorers, and traders who, alongside their mules, shaped the nation's destiny. But without these tireless creatures, the cities would never have come to life. Without them, the basic infrastructure of the West would have been impossible to build. And more importantly, without mules, the connections between various parts of the Old West would have been limited, making it impossible to create a commercial and social network. However, as the building of the West took place, a darker side of this story also unfolded. Mules were overburdened without mercy. They were forced to carry immense volumes of materials without any concern for their well-being. In the mining fields, for example, mules were used to transport vast amounts of mined ore, often in dangerous conditions and without adequate rest. The physical weight they carried was directly tied to the advancement of civilization, but the cost of this was never acknowledged by those who benefited from their strength. The Old West wasn't just a land of conquest, but a territory of constant threats. Pioneers, miners, and settlers faced invisible dangers like sandstorms and disease, but also real threats like Native American attacks, bandits, and wild animals. And while the men prepared to defend themselves, the mules kept carrying their heavy loads, unprotected, undefended, and unaware of what awaited them. They were exposed to all these risks, yet still they moved forward without hesitation, bearing the dreams of those who depended on them to survive. In many cases, the mules became direct targets of attacks. Bandits who knew the value of the loads carried by caravans would attempt to rob them by force. The mules would then have to traverse desolate, isolated regions, sometimes forced to run to escape ambushes. When attacks happened, the pioneers fought not just to protect their own lives, but also to ensure their mules survived. They were often more valuable than the gold or whatever else was being carried. Without the mules, the scarcity of resources could mean the end of an expedition. Even in combat and attack situations, the mules were indispensable. They didn't just carry essential goods, but also the items needed for the defense and survival of the entire caravan. Doctors, first aid tools, and even ammunition for the pioneers were carefully packed on the backs of these resilient creatures. If danger lurked nearby, the mules were still the anchor that kept the caravan together and moving. The difficulties and dangers were many, but the bond between the pioneers and the mules grew stronger with every adversity faced. But this sacrificial relationship also sparked outrage. How can the world ignore the countless sacrifices made by these creatures? They were used and abused, often with no recognition or proper care. They were forced to carry more than they could bear, yet continued their mission with silent courage. The growing revolt against this unfair treatment begins to emerge in the background of the Old West's story, where the mules, without asking for anything in return, helped make the impossible possible. As the Old West transformed from a vast, unexplored desert into a land of opportunity, mules became a central pillar of the emerging economy. Mining, trade, and agriculture would not have been viable without the tireless labor of these creatures. Gold and silver mines began to spring up across the region, but to transport the ore extracted from the depths of the earth to the markets or burgeoning towns, mules were indispensable. They carried heavy loads along rugged trails where other animals failed or couldn't endure. Trade, one of the greatest sources of wealth for the West, also depended on mules. They were responsible for transporting goods between cities, linking the Wild West to the rest of the country. Valuable cargo, such as food, fabrics, tools, and essential supplies traveled from one town to another thanks to these resilient creatures. Moreover, mules were vital for transporting weapons, ammunition, and other materials needed for military garrisons and the traders who formed the first supply networks in the West. Without mules, the growth of a market capable of sustaining the economy of the West would have been unthinkable. They ensured that life in the West kept moving, carrying the products that fed the populations and supplied the growth of cities. Mules' labor also played a crucial role in the agriculture of the West. The land was difficult to cultivate, with dry soil and uneven terrain, but mules helped transport seeds, heavy equipment, and the resources necessary to start farming in areas that once seemed impractical. They pulled plows and carried materials to build the first barns and homes for settlers. In this way, mules became key pieces in the foundation of the Old West, allowing it to not only survive but economically flourish, especially due to agriculture, which became a crucial economic pillar. The work of mules then became a symbol of growth and prosperity, even though, in the background, no one truly understood the sacrifice involved. However, as mules fueled the economy, a bitter reflection took hold of those aware of their sacrifices. The exploitation of these creatures was palpable. They were constantly forced to carry heavy loads under extremely adverse conditions. Even when they could no longer continue, they were beaten, forced to rise and move on. Trade and mining thrived, but the cost was too high for the mules, whose efforts were neither recognized nor rewarded. Progress for them meant endless fatigue, pain, and exhaustion. Yet the story of the Old West continued, ignoring this silent sacrifice. Over the years, the Old West transformed from a wild and unexplored land into a region full of life and thriving cities, but the silent contribution of mules largely remained invisible. As modernization took hold of the West, railroads, cars, and trucks began to replace mules in transporting goods and supplies. But the story of these creatures should not be forgotten. Mules were essential to building the West as we know it today, and their legacy endures in the infrastructure, expansion, and spirit of resilience that shaped the region. Although railroads and motor vehicles were the tools that ultimately transformed the economy of the West, mules continued to play a role in many aspects of daily life, even as industrialization began to dominate. In smaller towns, remote farming lands, and areas still without paved roads, mules remained the primary means of transport for families and merchants. Their ability to carry heavy loads efficiently and their resilience to rough terrain kept them essential. Even in more modern times, they represented the continuity of an era where perseverance and physical strength were all pioneers had to survive. However, the true legacy of mules lies not just in the impact they had on building the West, but in the symbol of human effort they represent. They became a reflection of the struggle for survival in an unforgiving territory. Their hard work, done without recognition, symbolizes the perseverance, resilience, and sacrifice of the pioneers, whose stories often went unnoticed while the heroes of the time were celebrated. Looking at the history of the Old West, we realize that without the mules, the development of this challenging land would have been unthinkable. They were the true drivers behind ensuring that progress happened, even when their names and efforts were sidelined. Today, mules may no longer be the protagonists of the West, but their legacy is still visible in the towns and fields they helped build. The sound of their hooves, the weight of their burdens, and the immense resilience with which they faced the adversities of the desert and mountains echo in the collective memory of those who still celebrate the era of the Old West. While railroads, cars, and other forms of transportation have taken over their roles, we must never forget that mules were and continue to be the true silent engine that made the impossible happen. As the story of the Old West unfolded, mules played a crucial role that was often overlooked or ignored. They were the true heroines of the West, never asking for recognition or glory. Their arduous, silent journeys through deserts, mountains, and treacherous terrain allowed pioneers, miners, and settlers to reach what we know today as the heart of America. With their silent strength and unwavering endurance, they were responsible for carrying the hopes of a better future across vast horizons of hardships and challenges. But while history glorifies the men who fought for the West, the mules were never truly celebrated. They were not sung about in ballads, nor were they given statues or monuments in their honor. Their contribution was invisible, yet without them the West would never have been conquered, developed, or colonized. Mules were the ones who allowed progress to happen. They carried the tools of civilization, commerce, agriculture, and infrastructure in the Old West, ensuring that the promise of a new life was not just a mirage. However, the silent heroism of mules is a metaphor for the Old West itself, a place where sacrifice, resilience, and hard work were fundamental for society to thrive. The true legacy of mules is found in how they helped shape the future, never expecting recognition. They are the reflection of all those who were not celebrated, but without their daily struggle, history would have been very different. Mules and their strength and resilience symbolize the spirit of the West, a spirit of overcoming, of resistance, and of sacrifice for a better future. Today, when we look at the West, instead of only remembering the men and women who made history, we should also remember those who, with hooves on the ground and burdens on their backs, transformed this wild land into a place where people could live. The true hero of the Old West wasn't just in its conquered land boundaries, but in the silent work of mules who, without recognition, contributed their strength and resilience to make the dreams of thousands of people a reality. And so, as the history of the Old West moves forward and is told, may the memory of mules finally be acknowledged, not just as pack animals, but as protagonists of a silent struggle that allowed the West to become what it is today, a land of hope, courage, and above all, resilience.